Thank you very much. So we have good news. We've reached a deal.
US President Donald Trump and European Union Chief Ursula von der Leyen have reached a trade deal.
With a 15% tariff agreement, the US and EU avoid a trade war. As the US and EU draft a trade framework, Trump boasts about the largest deal ever made, $1.3 trillion. That is the total amount of agreements President Trump has forced through in just 3 weeks with the UK, Japan, and the EU. However, one nation, America's Canada's largest trading partner, refused a bite. Ottawa walked away as Brussels agreed to a 15% tariff deal in exchange for $600 billion in investment pledges and $750 billion in U.S. energy. No press conference, no deal. Trump is now threatening to impose a 35% tax on Canadian imports beginning on August 1st. However, this is what no one anticipated. Canada is purposefully delaying negotiations rather than rushing like the EU. Prime Minister Carney is not simply disregarding the pressure, according to sources. He is completely avoiding the transaction trap in favor of a long-term strategy that is much more measured. In the background, Canadian troops, our industry insiders, are keeping an eye on Ottawa's covert expansion of Arctic operations and the creation of new energy corridors and shipping alliances that might survive Trump's administration and weaken American control over trade routes. There is more to this than a standoff. Canada's build-from-within resiliency and Trump's threatening deal diplomacy are facing off. Given that the EU gave in, why is Carney taking the chance? Exactly what precisely is taking place in the Arctic Circle shadows, away from the sight of cameras and tariffs? Let's dissect it. Let's continue where we left off and get right to the core of this conflict. The infamous 15% framework of Trump and how Carney's calculated rejection has changed the course of events. Here's what truly happened. At Turnberry on July 27, 2025, Trump sealed an agreement with the European Union. The 30% tax he had been brandishing like a hammer didn't go full force. Rather, he agreed to 15%. To be clear, though, that still strikes difficult. Currently, over 70% of all European goods shipped to the US fall into that 15% category. To put that into perspective, the average tax on those goods was only 2.5% prior to June 2025. Therefore, even though it's not 30, it's still a huge leap. Europe sensed it too. In that agreement, Brussels committed to strengthening its energy relations and increasing strategic purchases from the United States, particularly in areas such as defense, technology, and fuel, are commonly interpreted as attempts to win political favor in Washington. The trade change was anchored by that enormous amount. The leaders of Europe made strong promises to prevent higher tariffs. Trump's strategy with Japan, the UK, and Vietnam is similar to this. Use is imminent. Offer a tempered agreement in conjunction with mega contracts after using trade penalties as leverage. But this is where Carney comes in. The EU gave in, but Carney's team refused to back down. The same trap he refused to fall into. His approach avoided falling into Trump's deal trap by turning down significant pledges that would force Canada into a similar position of dependence. U.S. negotiators who were accustomed to opponents resigning were taken aback by this straightforward rejection. By refusing to exchange its supply sovereignty for temporary tariff relief, Canada completely circumvented the framework. Because of this, Carney is now viewed in the U.S. not only as an equal player, but as one that is savvier. There are serious repercussions. If other allies follow Canada's example, Washington's typical tariff scare tactics could lose their effectiveness. The U.S. might have fewer incentives to dangle if Carney's tough posture becomes the norm. What appear to be leverage might turn into meaningless threats. To put it briefly, Carney rejected Trump's 15% framework was suggested. After giving up, the EU accepted billions. Canada didn't. America is shocked. The actual headline is that, following up on the framework discussion, we now pay close attention to Canada's audacious turnabout. Taking on new in response to pressure from Washington earlier that month, Canada firmly resisted any hurried agreement, saying that talks were still tense and that Ottawa would only accept a stable and equitable agreement rather than one that was imposed on it by arbitrary deadlines. This was around the middle of July. Canada decided to postpone signing any hurried agreement rather than rush to comply. Any hasty decision jeopardizes long-term interests, the Prime Minister stated, emphasizing moral restraint. Each province joined a unified national reaction in the meantime. Canada took action in mid-March to identify important businesses that require protection by collaborating closely with the provinces. This partnership resulted in a domestic strategy for supply chain security, without depending on import from the U.S. By removing internal trade obstacles by July 1st, National productivity was expected to increase by 4 to 8%, and internal expenses may be reduced by up to 15%. British Columbia, Ontario, and Alberta have developed backup plans behind the scenes. They recognize steel, aluminum, forestry, and auto parts as high-risk industries. The plan was obvious: support regional value chains instead of caving under the pressure from the U.S. A tactical retreat from Trump's threat and deal diplomacy is demonstrated by this stance. The agreement trap created by tariff brinkmanship was avoided by Canada. It didn't to reduce the rate, agree to large energy purchases or investment commitments. Rather, it strengthened supply security and internal resilience. The stakes are real and serious. North America will incur expenditures if vital sectors are subject to 35% tariffs. Carney's rejection goes beyond simple disobedience. It's a calculated wager on sovereignty that was constructed from the ground up. In addition to escalating the atmosphere in the discussions, Trump's public statements gave Canada a surprising media edge. It's not truly a negotiation, as President Trump acknowledged when he said, "We haven't been focused on a trade deal with Canada," and stressed about July 25, 2025. He also implied that Canada might just ultimately pay tariffs rather than negotiating a deal. In sharp contrast, officials within the U.S. side persisted in characterizing the discussions as fruitful. Washington's public image and credibility were damaged when this internal strife was revealed to the media and onlookers. Canada took advantage of the communication lapse. The conversation was presented as one-sided by Ottawa. They contend that the U.S., not them, is to blame if discussions fail. The group led by Carney embraced that story. Canadian officials reaffirmed Canada's commitment to fair negotiations in the days after Trump's comments. They said the true barrier was Washington's rambling messages. Many people found resonance in those remarks. According to expert analysis in The Guardian and The Washington Post, Trump's team's conflicting messages reduced U.S. power and portrayed Canada as the more sensible operator in the eyes of the world. The Canadian dollar lost almost 0.5% of its value by the end of July, due in part to diminishing optimism for a deal, but Ottawa took advantage of the occasion to support its rhetorical stance of composure and steadiness. Canada gained the platform as a result of that change in the narrative. It presented Ottawa as the cautious partner requesting stability and structure from a fragmented American side, rather than as the hawk opposing tariffs. Essentially, Trump unintentionally changed the media narrative with his own remarks. Canada gained the moral upper hand as a result. This lessened the effect of his impending threat of a 35% tariff. A great example of multinational messaging gone wrong. To wrap out the story, let's look at how Canada used the tariff dispute to its advantage in the Arctic. Prime Minister Carney first presented a comprehensive plan in mid-March 2025 in order to increase Canada's visibility in the North Underbill C5. In addition to allocating more than $6 billion Canadian dollars to Arctic infrastructure and sovereignty initiatives, like as a new Arctic over-the-horizon radar system with Australia, the Act expedited significant projects. By the end of June, Bill C5 was granted royal assent, and provinces began working together to construct roads, ports, and community-driven energy initiatives. In an effort to improve Arctic connection and Indigenous-led diplomacy, Ottawa established consulates in Greenland and Anchorage and appointed its first Inuit ambassador. Music Canada made an investment in tangible assets instead of pursuing Washington's tariff agreements. Strategic lithium, cobalt, and rare earth mineral reserves can be found in the Arctic, essential to clean technology and defense. In contrast, the United States continues to rely significantly on China, importing around 70% of its rare earth elements, particularly the heavy rare earths needed for military hardware and high-temperature magnets. Ottawa indirectly contested U.S. reliance by regaining control of infrastructure and supply lines, giving Canada clout in international commodity markets and diplomatic settings. Additionally, Carney's investment changed public opinion. Canada demonstrated proactive leadership and long-term planning rather than coming out as defensive in response to U.S. pressure. Trump's tariff threat became a geopolitical misfire as a result of this Arctic project. Washington talked primarily of agreements. Canada established policy-based and physical routes that bolstered sovereignty. Canada's Arctic confidence calmed the storm of Trump's trade war. It was more than just opposition. It was a well-planned counterattack that used strategic resources, domestic capability, and indigenous diplomacy. In North American trade politics, control is the new frontier. Canada doubled down on a long-term posture instead of a quick cure with the Arctic strategy. As Trump pressed for swift trade wins, Canada secretly increased its internal infrastructure by the beginning of April 2025. Ottawa made more than 30 commitments. 9 billion Canadian dollars spread over 4 years to safeguard Canadian value chains, reindustrialize domestically, and strengthen sovereignty. Canada decided to change the regulations rather than follow the EU or Japan's strategy of swiftly rolling down tariffs. In late June, Ottawa approved the One Canadian Economy Act, or Bill C-5, which eliminated interprovincial trade restrictions and expedited accelerate national infrastructure approvals. By giving provinces and Indigenous leaders structure rather than fear, that statute allowed them to direct projects according to their own schedules. It was strategy, not response, that made Canada unique. Canada developed resiliency in areas where Trump made deals, where Washington used export restrictions, and Ottawa strengthened its supply chain by eliminating reliance and fostering domestic production in response to trade war fears. In the meantime, Canada sided with provinces, Indigenous groups, and regional stakeholders to save important industries. They concentrated on key minerals, forestry, and automobiles. In order to avoid tariffs, they refused to accept ad hoc investment pledges. Rather, they only gave the option to sign when a deal made sense. Canada became resilient and adaptable in its preparedness as a result of this strategy. Ottawa is prepared to participate if Washington changes its mind and offers a reasonable, open agreement, but Canada will join on its own terms and not under pressure. Essentially, Ottawa transformed Trump's transient, headline-driven threat in a one-sided game using the deal model. Canada changed the course of events. Under Bill C-5, its long-term industrial and infrastructural plan did more than just withstand pressure from the U.S. As a result, Canada became the author of its own trade story. Therefore, Carney's reluctance to enter into a framework agreement right away was not defiance. By itself, it was a complete overhaul of North American trade strategy, starting with sovereignty. Trump believed Canada would recoil when he brandished the hammer of a 35% tariff. What he didn't anticipate, however, was a chilly, deliberate pause, not fear nor retreat. The EU quickly made trillion-dollar concessions, whereas Canada made a new strategy. Put off the agreement, protect the country, and subtly increase your influence in the Arctic. Carney refused to sign under duress. On his land and schedule, he rewrote the terms. One thing is evident now, that there is no deal in place and the tariff clock is running out. Washington is no longer in possession of the leverage. The location is in Ottawa. What comes next, then? Will the U.S. be forced to engage in genuine negotiations by Canada's patience? Or will Trump escalate the situation and force Canada to make a last-minute withdrawal? What about Canada's new geopolitical card, the Arctic? Could the balance of power in North America be altered by rare earth control up north? Trade is no longer the only factor here. When the game changes, it's about who controls the board, you know. What are your thoughts? Should Canada sign quickly to avoid penalties or continue to wait for the ideal deal? More extensive harm? Comment below with your thoughts, as the quietest player may just be the one forming the final product.